Yeah, as I mentioned before, currently I'm in Requena, Spain, teaching at the music festival put together by Musical Arts Madrid, relatively new private school here in Madrid, where I'm on a faculty along with my wife Eugenia, who plays the flute, and I mention her because a lot of what you were prompting me to talk about in terms of working with the commissions and working with more composers has to do with my work in the chamber music realm with the flute and with other instruments as well. To draw some parallels or to look back at the time when I was competing, when very often, I think in every competition, there was a set piece, either from the standard repertoire, but oftentimes a piece that would be commissioned for that particular competition, or even a piece that was recently discovered and published and thus put on the radar by setting it as a set piece for a competition. So those are, for example, a few strategies that competitions use, excellent strategies, especially when it comes to commissioning. And I do remember that when back in the days when I was competing, I would have a certain set of repertoire, certain set of pieces that would be my sort of like standard pieces that I feel very comfortable with, that I would play from competition to competition. But then again, the set pieces was something that one would have to put some extra work on and learn, and as you said, sometimes on a even shorter time frame. I don't consider myself a player who can learn a piece in 2-3 days. I've witnessed some people do that. Specifically my friend Zoran, who would forget what is the set piece and then would learn something overnight, has that capacity. I like very much analytical approach, which I think, learned from my teacher in Zagreb. Actually, both Zoran and I studied with the same teacher, Darko Petrinjak. I reference him very often because he showed me how to analyze the piece and how to pay attention to everything that it's written on the score. So I'm emphasizing that from a point of now a teacher and teaching students to not look only for partial information on the score, which are primarily indications of the pitches, and thus go directly to finding the first source of information, where do I play that particular pitch. But I like to prompt my students now that when they are working with the pieces, whether it is from a standard repertoire and or a newer repertoire, to be really aware, sort of like to have a set of a checklist to understand. Let's say the title of the piece itself can already communicate a lot what is the piece about. Here we are in the presence of lots of composers, so when possible, I would very much advise to be in touch with the composer to seek information about the piece beyond what's written there. Sometimes the pieces would have some program notes, but I think also in my experience working with the composers is that composers are very happy to provide all sorts of informations and to clarify any questions that performer can have when they are embarking on learning the piece and performing it. Learning about a composer, him or herself, sometimes we are dealing with the music that it's recent, but maybe composer has passed away. So interesting to learn about a composer and under which circumstances or at what point in their life, personally and professionally, did they develop that piece, and what kind of musical and stylistic and compositional approach do they use in that piece. It is important to understand the structure of the piece right from the onset, whether we are dealing with just number of forms, whether it is a suite, whether a sonata, prelude, introduction, whatever it is, because that sort of immediate sense of the structure of the piece really helps me tremendously understanding how the piece moves and how can I see it development of that piece over the larger scale and phrasing. Again, paying attention to the most basic of the things that we have in the piece, like a key signature, time signature. Those are very important things. I come back to the notes and pitches that are something that we really want to learn very quickly, because that gives us the first sense of what is the piece about, perhaps, unless we have a recording that we can listen. I think it's important to listen to the recordings, but from a perspective of giving you some idea of how the piece sounds, so that you can have a general idea, but not something that substitutes all these other checklists that I'm talking about, because one has to understand everything that is happening in the music, not from the recording, not from learning it by ear, but from sort of like an analytical perspective of a musician, of knowing what actually it's written in the score. One of the things that happens very, very often, I'm sure that we have encountered, all of us who have thought often, is that you would make so many more corrections about wrong rhythms than the wrong pitches. And I tell to my students, if they play me a correct pitch at the wrong time, that still qualifies, in my opinion, a wrong note, because it's simply misplaced in the terms of timing, and the timing is tremendously important. Nathan, you've redacted this interview that was posted on the Twisted Spruce website, that I mentioned a very particular experience that I've had recently by listening a piece by Augusta Reed Thomas in Chicago, performed by Chicago Symphony and conducted by a young conductor, a friend of ours. And what was striking about it is that the conductor had to be so well prepared and to know the piece so well, and to conduct the orchestra, to conduct every single entrance in the piece that had, I mean, if it is not every measure, maybe every other measure, the time signature was changing. So this is kind of pieces that I think in contemporary music, that element of changing the time signature, even changing rhythm, or even using a polyrhythm, is such a element that did not exist in a music that's, let's say, 100 years ago. Until that point, that wasn't really so much of an element. So the timing, understanding of the timing, is becoming increasingly more important element in understanding the new pieces, and knowing how to go about it, knowing what to do. So placing the right pitches at the right time constitutes a right note. Otherwise, it's not. Another thing that is super important from our perspective as a guitarist is to understanding and to interpret the structure of the piece from sort of like a mechanical perspective of our instrument, meaning the fingerings both for the left and for the right hand. Oftentimes, I love when the composers indicate as many ideas via written fingering in the score, so that the performer does not have to guess whether composer is aiming for the sonority of a scale, or perhaps of a campanella sort of sound that comes from the guitar, because guitar has that peculiarity of ability of creating a soundscape that can be very different, even if the notes are the same. So very often I like when the composers write that. If I have any doubt in working on the piece, and I'm not really sure what a composer wants with a certain passage, what kind of sound he or she is looking for, I would try to make an effort to clarify that with the composer. Another very important thing in the score to pay attention as we are working right from the start are the dynamics. Now, if our brain assimilates information, right, and memorizes a certain movements, now the dynamics are also movements of our fingers. It's simply intensity of our right hand plucking harder or softer, which is a physical movement that our brain registers and through the repetition absorbs it as information. So if we learn one piece with the non-existing a dynamic plan, that means that we have to relearn that whole memorization information in our brain that has to include a new element. So now whenever we have something that is very well established in terms of memory, and then we add a new element to that, it's harder to break it apart to introduce a new element, because our brain tends always to go to what's already learned, sort of what we call a muscle memory. So dynamics right from the start. Another thing very important that I point to my students, and I again make a reference to my teacher in Zagreb, Darko Petrinjak, is phrasing. Oftentimes in the music, the phrasing sometimes is indicated, but it's more indicated if we look through the scores of I don't know, orchestral score, or even when I'm looking at markings in the flute writing. But the flute writing oftentimes has those, as a wind instrument, has those markings that are more for a breath, perhaps. They are also phrase markings, where I think in our scores for guitar, those phrase markings are not really the thing. They are not really written in so much. So as a performers, we have to make an effort to identify those phrases, because it's the same like when we are telling the story. If we are reading off a text that has no capital letters, that doesn't have commas or full stops or question marks or exclamation points or any kind of, or that it's not even split into paragraphs, the way we read the text without those indications would be something as more akin to us having to decipher what is it about, and then after a while understand, oh, this is what it means. Oh, this is where I have to make a little pause in my speech. This is where there should be a full stop. I should stop here. So as the music score does not have those indications for the phrasing, it's important for us right away to notice those, where those are, to make those markings, and to practice the piece in that way, so that those phrases are clear. What else? Articulation. We have many things that are written there for articulation. Some of the simplest are staccatos or legato kind of articulations in our playing. Us being plucked instrument, that means that we are much more on a side of articulated playing. So it is more challenging for us to make a very sort of like a singing line. So I think that has to do more with understanding the music and understanding how inside of our mind those lines are created first in here. How do we imagine them? How do we hear them in order to execute them through the fingers? And oftentimes I would say that in our teaching, I'm sure everybody who teaches have been able to see this, is that if we don't formulate, if the student doesn't, or a performer does not formulate a clear musical idea in their mind, and then practice for that idea to come across as it was envisioned it here, right, or understood from the score, then process that envision here. Then the third step is delivery through our fingers. If we don't do that, oftentimes what I'm finding is that the musical idea, it's sort of like a mishmash that comes as a result of a physical movements, and it's sort of like, okay, whatever happens as a result of me moving the fingers, rather the result of me formulating the idea first and then trying to execute that through my practice later on. Voicing. We are a polyphonic instrument. We are also melodic instrument. We play, of course, most similar instrument to us would be a piano. So voicing and dynamics to me go hand in hand, because this is where we have to pay attention to make a distinction between what we feel that is important in terms of dynamic, bringing out the melodic part, and working consciously. And I say consciously in a way that we understand and that we are very careful in what actually comes out when we play, whether the secondary lines, if you want to call them accompaniment or a bass line, we want to play them softer so that the melody has more space to shine through. We have to really either record as we are working. That's a tremendous tool that we use when we learn new pieces. And really truly understand whether that melody is uninterrupted, if we are playing it legato when it has to be played legato, or is it the case, which often happens, I think, that we formulate the idea in the head and we play with that idea and it's clear to us, but what it's actually coming out from what we are playing, it's not quite so much the case. So one has to record and listen so that you can put your mind in a full 100 capacity of a critical listener, rather than when you're playing, your brain processing power is involved very much with playing. So your listening ability is much more diminished in comparison than when you're just listening. Expression of the pieces, very often what composer wants in the piece, it's very, very well written. You know, we all know some of the examples in the pieces of lots of details that are put by, from the composers in telling to the performer, providing information what performer was. So the first composer that comes to my mind would be Roland Jans. When we look at his score, you know, if we take away just the music from it, still what's left on the paper would be a tremendous amount of information that it's written. And Roland was very peculiar of what he wants in it with his music and how to be played. Or Philip Houghton from Australia, in his a very artistic way of putting in the score what he really wants, what he has in his mind to be written. So as I say, paying attention to all the information that is on the score, not just finding the pitches and then trying to sort of sift through that. Then next thing that helps me with working on a piece is internalizing for myself. Obviously, if we have a composer who write a piece and give the pieces, let's say, that has a programmatic character, meaning that it has a story behind, that it's written based on a certain clear programming idea. That idea helps a lot because immediately we have something that feeds our imagination, and I tend to create in my mind almost like a movie that is going on, and that the music that I'm performing is a soundtrack to that movie, and then the expressivity that goes along with that is enhanced by that imagination of imagining those scenes that are exciting or sad or whatever they can be. So imagination and storytelling. So internalizing the story from the composer. If there's no story, then I create my own story. And very often I ask my students, you know, for next lesson, write me a story about this piece. What does it mean? And let's create sort of like an artistic or emotional content for it. So yeah, that's about approach of learning the new music, regardless whether is it for a competition or just learning. Music is music, no matter in which context. So yeah, that's about it.
That's a heavy answer. Thanks, man. Does anybody here want to weigh in, or does anybody have a comment or thought? It's like the ultimate Denis Azabagic checklist just happened, and you know that is a tried and tested checklist. If anyone has ever given you one, so yeah, Thatcher.
Thank you so much. So you mentioned, of course, with your long history of doing competitions, you played a lot of set pieces. Was there ever anything that you would see in a given score that would kind of put you off a little bit? You know, sort of make you go like, oh
Oh
no, I
yeah,
really don't want to see that.
plenty. Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, even plenty of the pieces that would put you off, and you're like, I don't like this piece, but I'm gonna play it because that's a set piece for the competition. That means I have to enter that competition, and I have to do the best that I can with it. That's it, right? So oftentimes, let me break it into two categories. Then your question is excellent. So yes. One category is I would see pieces that I played for the competitions and never returned to them, and they were pieces that stayed in my repertoire for many years after that. If there are certain parts in the piece that are, well, let's just define what off-putting means, right? Because if I have an off-putting piece that I don't really like, that doesn't speak to me now, I'm not going to say it's a terrible piece. I'm just going to say, this is not my cup of tea. I don't like this piece. I don't like this language. I don't want to do it. Which, later on in years translates a little bit to personal affinity towards a certain musical language and inclinations to work with the composers that you like their language, and you start commissioning those people to write for your chamber, for my chamber groups. But if it is something off-putting within the piece that I really like, then I have found those. I'll tell you about a few instances. There has been an instance in one of our projects, recording project, where for us it was always important to have a collaborative relationship with the composers. And that's why I think what Twisted Screw does is a fantastic project. And I think it has to be acknowledged, and I always do, when people ask me, oh, did you ever think of writing some pieces? I said, never, because I don't have that voice inside of me, so I'm staying away from it. I don't want to fake it. I don't have it. I love taking the piece, understanding what is it about, and bringing it through life through my ability as a performer to do that. I love that process. And then when working with the composers, I do think that it's important to have both experience and talent of a composer on one hand, the creativity of a composer, and also experience and creativity of a performer to say, yeah, I understand what you're trying to do, but that's not going to really work with the instrument, or the way you want to do it doesn't work. Let me give you an idea that what may work. So together you decide about something. So there's, there has been one instance, as for one of the projects where we've commissioned a number of composers to write the pieces. And there was one composer that when I played my solo part, it really worked very well. But when we started putting it together, it just felt in terms of form that the piece didn't really work. So when we made a suggestion to the composer, can we work a little bit about a form? Can we make some variety in terms of variations or modulations, anything, so that it doesn't seem so repetitive within the same context, because it was based on a song. The composer wasn't very open to the idea, and since we did not enjoy the final product, so to say, the composition. We decided not to put it on the recording. We didn't really think that it worked. So that was an off-putting in one way. In other, let's say, parts of the composition, if they are off-putting, if I don't really like them, could be some ideas that I change with the living composers that I know, and they know that I will do something, and if it's not their idea, and I just say to them, I like it this way, so deal with it. I make a little change, but it's not a fundamental change really. If I wouldn't respect the quality of the composition, I wouldn't be playing it in the first place. So if there's any change, it is a very, very minor. It doesn't really changes what is really the piece about.
Okay, thank you very much.
Mm-hmm.
Anyone else have a follow-up? That was a great question, especially because the pieces that people are writing are, the Twisted Spruce is funny because what we have are 14 guitarists, and each one has their own set piece written by a composer. And so, you know, those details on the score can really make a difference. Okay, what about this, Denis? Have you ever had a set piece that was given to you in an amount of time that had errors or needed correction for some reason? And how did you either edit it, or what are your thoughts on editing a score? Or do you try to pull a composer aside and say, like, you know, what should I do here? Here are two good options. And have you been met with resistance to that?
Well, I just told one story that there has been resistance about a form of the piece, but not so much on the editing side, right? And I understand where your question comes from within the context of the project that you are doing, because you here have a composer and a guitarist paired together under a certain time frame, and it has to be done by a certain period of time. I did not have a problem of timing, because for us it was always project, you know, the final project, the final recording was, you know, a year or two ahead when we start commissioning. So that wasn't so much the issue there. And luckily, as I said, all the composers we worked for were very open to changes. And I have to stress out, for example, another great example of how to change the piece, like with one of composers, Clarissa Sad. She has composed several pieces for us. One of which was, I believe, for flute, guitar, cello. Oh no, flute, guitar, and a string quartet. And there was a middle movement with the introductions, first by cello, then viola, then guitar. And I remember as we were practicing that and sending her the demo, and one moment she just came back and said, take the viola out completely. The whole section, just crossed it over. You know, whenever we would ask her, Clarice, can we do this, or can we do whatever you want, whatever you think it's better, do that. So fortunately, you know, besides that one time, I did not have those experiences of feeling that sort of resistance. Now, in the context of an event like this, I think that the initial conversation between the paired guitarist and composer, there has to be a great understanding in, I would say, stressed few elements. If the composer has no knowledge or limited knowledge about writing for guitar, right from the start, that element has to be observed heavily, and composer has to rely on the guitarist's experience, or providing that experience and feedback on mechanical aspects of composing for guitar. So before, if a composer has idea to write something in certain way, that idea should be spoken, and the meeting should be held to discuss that, to understand what guitar can do, what works, what doesn't work. Because if if that element is not there, if the composer writes the things for the guitar from a perspective, let's say, of a piano or some other, and you have unexperienced or younger composer who takes time to learn the things and cannot see right from the start if some things work or not, that's where we will get to the point where the deadline looms very, very quickly on the horizon, and there has to be lots of changes because there's a lot of material that is simply unplayable on our instrument. So that kind of conversation has to start has to happen right from the very start.
Yeah. Awesome. Anybody else?
And you
have
know,
anything?
in sort of like a follow-up to that, for example, I'm planning of inviting the Sergio Sa to present a sort of like a crossover masterclass for composition students and guitar students, in a way to you know, get his experience, you know, tremendous experience as an incredible guitarist and a composer. Like, how does his mind work when he composes for guitar or when he composes for the other instruments or even orchestra? What are the key elements that we can have in mind to write it? And I remember somebody telling me about anecdote, whether it is true or not, I do not know, but how Torova was composing for guitar on the piano would be to use the left hand with only one finger and the right hand with the 5 fingers. And that was his limitation of what kind of texture he would write. And that makes sense in a way, you know, that you have a bass line, you have few fingers for the accompanying and something for the melody. Now that can be completely different from many styles of composing that we can see today, but still there's a certain way of, let's say, to keep in mind what are the limitations on the guitar, and also what are the key idiomatic guitar related textures or things the guitar does really very, very, very well, and that the composer can use that in his or her toolbox when writing for guitar.
Awesome. I love the Taroba thing. It's almost like the Bach. You know, the Bach Lautenwerk. You know, he like was experimental, right, and had these instruments developed. Something like the lute. Anyways, and anyone want to hop in? Denis, what's one thing that you've learned on the road that nobody taught you in music school?
No, it wasn't one.
Oh, you could, yeah, you can throw in 3 there. That's fine.
I'll tell you one. Going back to the competition, performing live in competitions. I remember going to several times to a competition in southern Spain in a place called La Herradura. They still have a competitions in the name of Andres Segovia. And that competition was held back in the days when I was competing, from the 2nd to the 4th of January, those 4 or 5 days, the first week of January. Now, at the time, in that area of Spain and also here in Valencia, you know, the housing wasn't really, you would never see like a heating in the house, because if it was cold, you would just turn on a little heater for a few days that it's a little cold, and then it's gone. So everywhere you would go in that time there, you would feel cold. So when we are on the stage playing, they're putting a little heater behind us, which is warming up our back, and it's really hot, where the fingers on front are still cold. And every single competitor was complaining how we are playing with the cold fingers. It's so cold, it's so cold, it's so cold, it's so cold. Oh my God, you know, when you compete, you complain about everything. And then there was a lady who was their guitarist, and she said, you know what? Just learn to play with the cold fingers. And that was a tremendous lesson to me. It just stayed with me, like, you know, whatever the conditions are that you are performing at, and sometimes it's a cold fingers, right? Sometimes it's a sweltering hot and you are so sweat. You just do the best you can do in that moment. Or sometimes it's just, I don't know, you know, mosquitoes are biting you so much in Mexico that it's tremendous. So in any ways, you know, to make the story short, it's if in a performance you're dealing with a situation that is unpleasant, that it's not something that are your ideal conditions, you just have to make the best out of it. You know.
Yeah, it's good advice for Twisted Spruce people.
Another piece of advice that I got was from one member of the jury, Antonio Ruiz Pipo. He was in one of my juries in Benicassim, and he came to me at a time and says, you have to learn how to play between the notes. And that's over time that sort of like internalized and realized what is the imagination, what is the story, where the music lies behind those notes. Sort of like an inner world. Yeah, so that's those are perhaps two key moments from the road.
All right, guys, we have about 6 minutes left here. Anybody have any thoughts for Denis, or want to pick his brain about anything?
If someone else has a question, I'd rather they go before me since I already asked one. But if no one else has one, mind if I ask another one?
You may ask all the questions you want. You have 6 minutes.
Okay. So one thing I was actually thinking about, especially since the GFA just happened, was the thought about the set piece. And I was wondering, given that you've experienced it from so many different perspectives, it seems to me sometimes that, of course, the set piece for a GFA or any type of competition has to be to a certain level of difficulty for it to sort of pose a challenge. But sometimes I feel like the pieces, it almost gets the level of difficulty in the short amount of time almost gets in the way of the competitor's ability to truly play it, as you said, with the music between the notes to tell the story of the piece. So I was wondering, from your perspective, where would you draw the line, if you could, between, in an optimal situation, having just that a sufficient amount of difficulty while still allowing the performer to give a truly informed musical performance?
Another great question to which I don't think I can provide a correct answer. And I think there are only all these possibilities. If it would be my personal call, I would lean towards the lesser technical difficulty to give a room, because we have a limited time when the competitors can learn the piece. It's from the day it is published to the day they have to perform, right? So I would say less of a technical difficulty, more on interpretative and musical aspects of performance. But how do you set a limit to that? And I had a very interesting conversation not so long ago with Sergio about that. And he was telling me, like, I just cannot write an easy piece. I just feel so limited in my writing that if I put any limits, I do not know what to do, right? And we were mentioning, like, you know, Brouwer's, you know, 20 etudes, you know, which are very easy pieces, but brilliant pieces of music. Incredible didactical value that they have, right? Not difficult, but each piece has in it a musical content that has to be brought out. That to me is a brilliant example of easy pieces, fantastic, you know, didactical value from a technical perspective, but also musical. So as I mentioned, my personal choice would be to say, let's do something a little easier, right? And to give people time to assimilate it and perform more musically, in a sense. But then, you know, you're talking about GFA. You're talking now about a competition where people who go to compete there, or you know, they perform from an astonishingly high level. So maybe that's a part of the challenge. This is what you have to learn. You have 40 days to learn it, deal with that. That's what it is, right? So that's another element of competition, you know, judging their ability to assimilate technically very quickly and to still bring the music. So, you know, when you are throwing these kind of things into creativity within the competition context, the things are getting very much in a gray area over there. So that's why I don't like to set the limits on the composers. As I said before, I like to have a conversation. I like to have feedback going back and forth. But to set the limitations on when they are writing a piece for such an occasion, I would. Now, there's going to be a later on in somebody's career, right? When you're dealing perhaps with some physical issues of your body and of your hands, that you may ask a composer, listen, spare me of those, you know, difficult things, write me beautiful music, you know, but something easy that I can play. That's your prerogative as a commissioner of music later on in your career. But for the competition, I don't know. I would stay away from putting any limits to the creativity of the composers. Great question.
That makes sense. Thank you very much.
Anybody else? With 1 minute left to go. Ronnie, come on, you have a question. I know you do.
Nathan loves putting people on the spot.
Yeah, I'm just wondering off the last thing you said about you know, you letting the composer have all their creativity. How, when you've worked with composers, sort of how involved do you get in the idea creation process? I mean, maybe this bit doesn't work, or that bit doesn't work, or this is too loud, or I can't do this, or whatever. But
well, excellent question. Look, for example, all our projects that or commissions have been based on a certain type of music. As a duo, we again, going back to Sergio, who inspired us early on to say, no, guys, explore your backgrounds, right? Thus we did the Balkan project music, you know, based on music from my country, and then we have Sephardic Journey, you know, music from the Sephardic Jews that are, you know, music from Spain, from my wife's country, but involved in the sense that, for example, in the first one, I would literally pick the melodies and send them out to the composers and say, for the Balkan producers, I say, you know, make me a piece based on this melody, and I would choose the melody for each composer. For the second, it was like more like, you know, here is this music we want to be about. Choose your melodies, choose your things you want to work with. You know, so there was a broader freedom, so to speak, right? But in involvement in, you know, composers would send us the piece in the drafts, and they say, what do you think? How does this work? And I remember, I'll reference a dear friend of mine, Carlos Rafael Rivera. He was actually a composer of the set piece in 1998 in GFA when I won that competition. His composition was the set piece. That's how I met him. You know, and he's very successful now writing the music for the movies, for Netflix, right? But when he wrote one of the pieces for Sephardic Journey, and I just spoke to him recently, he said, the way I work with the directors now, which is like, you know, he sends the music and the directors say, no, I don't like that. That's not really the mood. Or, you know, it has to be longer, or this section has to be there. He says, man, this is what I need. I need you to push my boundaries. And this is exactly what has happened in one of the pieces. But, you know, I don't know when the Sephardic Journey happens, 7-8 years ago, when he wrote something fantastic. And I came back to him. I said, Carlos, this is a great idea. Keep going. Don't cut it short. Keep going. And that was something that he told me. He said, this was always my issue. Great idea, but off I move on to another. No. As a performer, I know that I need to spend more time with this to develop it, to give the story, to build it up, so that can go like this, rather than here it is, take it away. No, too short, right? So, and that's that. As I said, he actually made that reference recently because he's now involved composing for several series or movies, and he told me that exact thing. He says, I needed you to push me to expand. I needed you to, kick me in the butt and say, go for it a little more, right?
And you can ask which melodies you chose. That Sephardic thing's part of my history as well. So.
I don't know, because I did not choose the melodies, they did.
Right.
The only thing what we asked of them is to all the composers to be in contact and to sort of like a keep of track who chooses which melody, so that the final project wouldn't be based, too many pieces on the same melody, right? They didn't fight over it, by the way. I mean, there was a plenty to choose from, a trove of Sephardic music.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Denis.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Awesome. Well, Denis, thank you so much for being with us today. It's a pleasure, as always.
And thank you for having me. And as I said, I love this project because it's really a very, very creative-based initiative. So kudos to all of you, and